Hi, this is Bradley Barth with SC Media reporting from the Identiverse conference in Las Vegas. And my guest today is Andrew Cameron. He is an IT fellow in identity and access management at General Motors or GM. Andrew today led a session around best practices for implementing identity based API services that meet an organization's zero trust needs while at the same time providing a flexible, positive user experience. That always is the big challenge, isn't it, Andrew? Finding that correct balance between your organization's security needs and also having a positive user experience around identity. How do you maintain that balance at GM? And do you lean a little bit more toward the security side or the user experience side?
Well, I'm a security guy, right? So I'm going to lean more heavily on making sure that the proper experience is secured from end to end, right? So it was important for us to make sure that we worked with our business customers to make sure that the minimum security standard was implemented in all of our services. So things like MFA, things like the proper MFA methods that were enforced across all of our services. It's really important, and we had to work with our business to make sure that we did not allow any attack vectors into our backend systems. So that means API security played a heavy role in making sure that when we authenticate users, that only the valid users are getting back to our backend to be able to leverage our services. So it is a incredible balancing act because our business is very sensitive to friction, very sensitive to being prompted many times to actually get access to a service. So we had to make sure that we made sure that our MFA service was risk based, right? So that
Yeah.
we only prompted for our challenges when we detected some kind of a risk in the platform. So things like that were really important to kind of make sure that the user experience was balanced.
All right, so Andrew, identity services that are designed around consumers, B2C services, aren't always necessarily the same as identity services that are specifically constructed for your workforce or your employees. Can you tell us where are there overlaps and efficiencies where some of your identity offerings can be applied to both categories of users, and where is the consumer-oriented identity experience dramatically different from the B2C or workforce IAM experience?
Sure, it's really important to understand that the key differences between workforce and B2C IAM, things that are common, things like MFA has to be applied everywhere, right? It doesn't matter whether it's workforce or B2C, you have to consistently apply MFA. You have to consistently apply things like risk-based evaluation of the authentication transaction. So you need to have policies that apply on both sides that evaluate risk of the logged in user. But where it gets really different on a B2C perspective is that B2C has scale, right? So in our case, we're dealing with millions to tens of millions of users, and on the enterprise, that's really tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of users, right? So there's a difference in scale, and so you need to have more awareness on the B2C side of trends in login and authentication activity, where you could be subject to attack, right? If you're not being plugged into the analysis of those transactions, and you need to be able to apply policies and take and protections to be able to protect you on the B2C side, where you may not you have more control on the enterprise side.
Now, a key aspect of GM services transformation around identity was this migration to a cloud API service. From your own experience, can you identify some of the most key API security elements that help your application developers build identity platforms and services and ultimately create that user friendly zero trust experience that we're talking about today?
It was very important that we enforced kind of cloud identity standards for all of our API services that we enabled. So, we had a lot of legacy-based services that were doing, uh, you know, authentication methods that we didn't want to promote and bring to the cloud, right? It was a major migration standard that we implemented that we didn't want to just do lift and shift from the enterprise. We wanted to make sure we did strategic migrations when we moved something from on-premise into the cloud. So it was important that we enforced token-based authentication and made sure that we applied the same standards across all of the services that were migrating. So it was important. I got into my presentation. We talked about enforcing token-based authentication, enforcing OAuth and OpenID Connect as the identity standards across all of those services, And that allowed us to have a common language when we talk with our app teams to say that, this is a kind of a minimum standards you have to meet in order to move your service into the cloud. And that really helped because strong governance is so important when you're dealing with IT services in the enterprise that if you can have a set of rules that everyone is clear on as we get in to working with them, that makes it easier to let them know what they have to accomplish as part of the migration.
Andrew, one of the key recommendations that you made during your session was the notion of bringing everyone along for the ride when establishing reference architecture and building out basically these various systems that your entire organization, your enterprise needs to be familiar with. Give us a sense of what you meant by that.
Sure, it was really important from an enterprise IT perspective, an enterprise IT security perspective, to be able to set a level of standards that all of our app teams had to meet in order to be considered secure, right? And so we have an internal rating where we actually apply a rating system to all of our internal services. It's a 5-star rating that allows us to understand where the effort needed to be focused in terms of applications or teams that haven't been, their systems weren't up to standards as well as some others, right? So based on the 5-star rating, teams could then understand what they had to work on, and that allowed us to bring a governance structure to all of our applications that, they were able to understand, they were rated on consistently, and they applied that in their reasoning when giving priority to the work of what had to get migrated to the cloud, right? So that was really important. And there was also just sometimes you had to bring, sometimes it was the carrot, sometimes it's a stick, where you have to bring security-based influence into the discussion to say that, these services are really critical and it's important that we're adhering to, cloud authentication standards in order for you to migrate. And so that strong governance and that strong support from leadership becomes really important because sometimes you'll get into discussions around, well, we have to get this migrated based on this timeline, and you get suggestions to cut corners around security, and that's really where you get into trouble, right? Because those things end up not getting addressed until further down the line. So, we were fortunate that we have leadership in GMIT that was very supportive of security direction, very supportive of what our CISO was trying to implement, and so we were able to drive those standards as part of our migration to the cloud.
You also had a final takeaway during your session around continuous telemetry. So, where does that particular element to your overall game plan tie into, again, the identity and zero trust architecture that you were laying out for the audience today?
Yeah, it's really critical to have an understanding of the end-to-end view of all of the traffic that's flowing through your architecture. And so ITDR is kind of that identity-focused perspective on how you can do set policies to understand threats in your environment and to use the tools that are available to you to kind of, get through the data and kind of get really insights into what your behavior, the behaviors your customers are implementing. And so it's important to know things like when you see spikes in your environment for authentication, when you see spikes of failed attempts to log into your services, those are probably indicators of an attack, right? And so it's really important to use a consistent stream of telemetry to be able to get those insights and then turn them into policies or turn them into actions that you might need to take, because those insights are going to let you know that if you're under some kind of attack.
All right, well, we just heard from Andrew Cameron from General Motors, or GM. I'm Bradley Barth with SC Media, reporting from the Identiverse Conference.